Deze podcast is powered by ACC ICT, de nummer 1 Kubernetes specialist van Nederland.
Chris, thank you so much for making time to join us in our podcast. And can you give the listeners a short introduction of yourself?
Yeah, sure. Name is Chris Aniszczyk. I have the fun job of being a co-founder and CTO of the Cloud Native Computing, Foundation, which is hosted at the Linux Foundation, which is the home of, many open source foundations, not only CNCF, hosts Linux, GraphQL Foundation, PyTorch Foundation, and so on. So, that's kind of my day-to-day is working on CNCF, but I also help other Linux Foundation, efforts kind of scale up their developer programs and other open source initiatives.
So that's a lot.
That's a lot, yeah. It's not, you should look at his profile on LinkedIn. You see it's a lot.
Yeah, and there's also a recent announcement, literally as of yesterday. We've made a bit of a leadership change at the Linux Foundation and CNCF, where I've kind of broadened my role to be CTO of Cloud and Infrastructure, which includes CNCF at the Linux Foundation, but also Open Infra Foundation, which we recently merged into the Linux Foundation. So OpenStack and that kind of community has rolled into the Linux Foundation family foundations. We just have a lot of cloud and infrastructure initiatives in the Linux Foundation. So I'm having the fun job of overseeing more of them.
Yeah. So if you look back at the past 10 years of CNCF, what are some things you think has changed the most?
Oh my gosh, it is a fun, sentimental year, for us. It's been 10 years basically since the founding, of the organization and our first board meeting. I think what has always surprised me over times is I think the willingness for the community to expand its scope based on end user and wider, adopter and community needs. And so what I mean here is when CNCF started, we kind of had an initial goal. Let's go build an open source foundation to host Kubernetes and try to, build a standardized set of de facto components that makes container orchestration easier and make it run on every public-private cloud. That was always kind of the initial goal. What ended up happening over time is, people are like, we need to figure out how to observe and monitor, workloads, right? So there was an effort to bring in Prometheus into CNCF and it's standardize, something which is called OpenMetrics, which is really the Prometheus exposition format, and that kind of grew. Then the organization in 2017 was like, let's also bring peace to the container wars and bring in Container D, which essentially was Docker Engine and Rocket from CoreOS at the time. And so we started to host container runtimes in CNCF, which was initially out of scope. We never envisioned hosting container runtimes. And then, we continued to work with our community, and it's like, what's important? Having a full kind of audit log and declarative way to manage configurations, around your, Kubernetes setup and other tool setups. So things like Flux and Argo kind of came in, which were kind of de facto GitOps, workflow management tools. And those communities kind of grew significantly. So, and then, to continue the importance of observability, which is critical for, any workload at scale, an effort was to, say like, hey, can we do what Kubernetes did for kind of the infrastructure layer, but can we do that for the observability layer? So OpenTelemetry was born with the merger of OpenTracing, an existing CNCF project, and OpenCensus, which was another kind of open source effort out of Google and other industry members at the time. And boom, OpenTelemetry now is basically the Kubernetes of the observability space, with almost every observability product supporting OTel. So every kind of, year and segment, whatever the challenges around workloads or some aspect of cloud native, the community has kind of come together and rise a challenge to kind of build efforts to bring stability and standardization in any component. And in the latest evolution of this, we're seeing, we have all these lovely AI tools popping up into, our lives, right? And a lot of people don't realize things like OpenAI, Grok, all these kind of, ChatGPT related tools, 99% of the time are being powered by Kubernetes underneath the covers, running, whether it's like VLM or whatever related things at scale, right? So in Kubernetes, if you look at the last releases, generally you see things like, improved dynamic resource, allocation or DRA support, improved GPU related things, stable sidecar containers. A lot of these things are kind of built to improve running AI workloads at scale. So whatever workload it is, whether, it is containers, even VMs, AI related workloads, WebAssembly modules, the CNCF community comes together to kind of support these workloads, whether it's running them, observing them, and securing them. And so that's, what has kind of surprised me and over the years of how this kind of community continues to evolve to make sure it doesn't get stuck in the past. It is truly kind of the bleeding edge of open source infrastructure.
Yeah.
But so still a bit of a long answer. So.
No, that's fine. I know your time is so precious, but do you still consider Kubernetes a container orchestration platform? But that's what it essentially is.
Yeah, so I personally do not, right? Like, does it orchestrate containers? Well, absolutely. But, if you kind of just look at how the Kubernetes API works and how kind of the reconciliation engine is, it's really a generic system. It just happened to be the first thing that Kubernetes orchestrated and, reconciled an end state in a declarative fashion, happened to be stuff that needed to power and orchestrate containers. But if you kind of look at some other projects out there, you have things like KubeVirt, right? KubeVirt basically creates CRDs, resource composable resource definitions in Kubernetes parlance to manage in virtual machines side by side with containers. And then you have like crazy projects like Crossplane, which are using the Kubernetes API to go even a further level where you could describe generic cloud resources as like, I want to make a resource claim for a blob store, right? I don't care that blob store, is an S3 thing on Amazon or, blob or block storage on Azure. So it's trying to like generify, like, I need this type of thing. I don't care what cloud it comes from, right? So like, and Kubernetes goes and makes it possible to go fetch that, bit, make sure that it's, come up to date of basically what you need. And if something goes away, it'll go reconcile and make sure you have access to that resource. So it's kind of this generic, engine, I think, these days. But that's how I view it. And if you kind of look at the reality, that's what people are doing. People have created CRDs to manage all sorts of things, GPU-based workloads, a lot of the DRA, related work that's, going on.
But don't people also call it the OS for the cloud? Do you stand by that claim, or?
So if you think of operating system of like a generic, kernel that, runs application, then yeah, I could see how Kubernetes could definitely fit as kind of the operating system of the cloud. People have also called it the Linux of the cloud. So, I think there is a truism. It's not perfect, but if you start thinking about Linux, there's kernel space and user space, and like what does that mean in a Kubernetes sense? Where does the application sit? Where is the kernel space sit? And there are some analogies there. And I think for someone that is new to Kubernetes and CNCF, thinking about Kubernetes, that hey, it's kind of like Linux. Linux is basically everywhere. It's, phones, clouds, yada, yada, yada. And it kind of sits in that base layer. And you just have to know it's there, and maybe how to interface with it, but sometimes you don't really need to, because maybe you're, sitting, writing applications on a layer on top of Kubernetes, just like Linux. If you're working on the cloud or using some Amazon service, maybe you're running serverless stuff, Lambda, like you generally don't play with Linux or all that stuff. All the stuff you're running underneath is Linux. And if you need to drop down to the command line or the metal and, learn how to, poke around with your, with IP filters or, go through directories. Like, it's down there, but not everyone sees it. So I definitely I like the analogy of like Linux of the cloud or kernel, operating system of the cloud, because it's a simple one and a good one in many ways, but it is overtly simplistic, in my opinion.
Kost het beheer van Kubernetes je veel tijd en expertise? Maak kennis met ACC ICT. Zij ontzorgen je volledig met managed Kubernetes diensten op elke cloud. Gecertificeerde specialisten zorgen voor compleet beheer, 24/7 support en optimale beveiliging. Jij kunt je focussen op je core business, terwijl je Kubernetes-omgeving in betrouwbare handen is. Manage Kubernetes van ACC ICT. Jouw zorg, onze expertise. Bezoek accict.com.
Now, I was thinking about we've built Kubernetes for one goal, and you said it's because stateless stateless workloads, and you said we're changing now for virtual machines and WASM and more. But is that not changing the way we thought about Kubernetes? A wrong way. What I'm trying to say is stateful workloads. It's not properly working in Kubernetes. Is that?
So I will say, there's been a lot of work over, the years to make Kubernetes support, different things. Initially, it was Kubernetes was very good at stateless, workloads, running containers, short-term living.
It's easier, of course.
It's an easier problem set, right?
Yeah.
And then, arguably Kubernetes by default wasn't, terribly secure either. Right?
No.
It took a while to, hey, maybe we should introduce, RBAC into Kubernetes, and, RBAC has its own specific issues, but like over, pod security policies, there's always been kind of improvements over time. And back to your previous analogy, by the way, like Linux, is everywhere, but like Linux by default is not secure either, right? It's kind of how you configure it. Most people get their Linux from a vendor or a support distro, or if they're really fancy, they can roll their own, right? But that requires a high level of skill. And the reality of the world, most gets it from Red Hat or SUSE or, whatever. Kubernetes is very similar. The default out of the box configuration is kind of not meant necessarily for crazy production workloads, just like Linux, right? So, and to your point about stateful workloads, they're now, Kubernetes itself has like the basic pieces and plumbing to help with it, and kind of has features that have been built over the years to improve things. However, there are other projects out there, like, layers on top that sit in CNCF. You have Vitess. Vitess is kind of a layer on top of MySQL that, basically helps it scale on systems like Kubernetes. You also have a new effort in CNCF called CloudNativePG. So for the Postgres,
we had them in the podcast earlier.
So
a few hours ago. So
perfect timing. So you should know that, like, it's not fully true that Kubernetes doesn't support stateful workloads. It just continues to get better, and improvements are being made to Kubernetes itself to kind of get there. And it's like, it's for everything. It's like, if you look at I think in the Kubernetes for many years, like batch workloads and stuff like that was pretty crappy, right? Especially if you were using it for AI and ML related workloads. I think it was in Kubernetes 1.2.6 where that API got incredibly, improved, over time to kind of support, parallel workloads a little bit, better. And so it's just like, over time, the community gets together and works with our end users, whether it's the CloudNativePG folks or, hey, it's NVIDIA and all these other, GPU vendors that are trying to, orchestrate, GPU workloads, which have different requirements than, let's call it container, based, workloads. So community gets together, makes some improvements to Kubernetes APIs or, improves an API, deprecates an old one, institutes a new one through the KEP process. And so it's just, just like Kubernetes itself, it's dynamic.
It's getting better, of course. The stability is getting better. But I was thinking about what is the biggest challenge for Kubernetes at the moment?
Oh, the biggest challenge, I think, is, I think there's two ways I think I would look at it. One is from the maintainer community perspective of it is the project's over 10 years old now. There's been a lot of maintainers and kind of growth in the project, and the growth of maintainers is fairly stable, right? Like it's not as crazy in the early days where things were just, absolutely bananas. Companies popping up everywhere. Now Kubernetes is fairly stable, and ensuring that we keep bringing in new people to help with the development and features and that kind of good. It's kind of just like Linux. It's like, in Linux, we had to institute a lot of mentorship programs. We actually have someone hired at the Linux Foundation that's a fellow, Shua. Shua's main job is to mentor and bring in new contributors to the Linux kernel, because in university, it just seems people don't really learn, Linux as common, right? So just ensuring that you have like the right talent to maintain and start contributing. And Kubernetes is not at that point yet, but you kind of see similar patterns where it's just, everyone just kind of moves up the next layer. So you want to ensure that you always have fresh contributors and talent that kind of become the next generation of maintainers. It's that to me is a challenge for the next, Linux is 34 years old now, right? Kubernetes is about, let's call it 11 years old now. So it's got some time to catch up. But
in Linux, we've got still Linus. He does a lot.
He does a lot. And I don't know if you saw recently in the news, he met Bill Gates for the first time. He had dinner with Mark Recipinovich, who's a CPU at Azure, and Bill Gates. So it was a very, he still does an amazing amount of work, right? Yeah. A lot of reviewing. And also Greg KH, who's also at the Linux Foundation, an incredible amount of work. And you have those heroes in the Kubernetes community. There's folks like Jordan, Liggett, who is it's probably the top contributor overall in terms of commits, and amazing human, very, very, very quiet and just keeps to himself person, but does an amazing work in the community. And we need to make sure we have more of those, folks that can come into our, in our community. So that is I think a challenge from a community perspective that every successful open source project has. In terms of a technology.
Yeah, that was my next question.
Look, you can't escape the AI hype cycle we're in. These tools are very, very useful in many ways. Yes, they're not perfect, but they're being used, and we have an incredible amount of GPUs being deployed, data centers being built. So now there's different types of workloads. So it's rising to the challenge to ensure that Kubernetes and the surrounding community could orchestrate, secure, and observe GPU-based workloads. And you kind of see this happening. It's we need to add a feature to improve how scheduling is done, because GPU-based workloads like things called gang scheduling, which is kind of a different way of thinking about things from the traditional, classic, container workloads maybe. Also, LLMs, when you run them, have a very different kind of profile maybe than a typical HTTP-based, workload, right? It's just the way these things work are a little bit non-deterministic, take maybe a little bit longer start time. It's so working to ensure that we support that next generation workload and make sure everything works in a classic sense is the challenge I think that Kubernetes is rising to and will hopefully continue to rise to. And Linux went to the same thing where Linux was not really meant to be stuffed on phones and blasted into space on satellites, but here we are today.
Linux was built as a modular stacking on software. I've got another question.
Sure.
I think we're running a bit out of
time. How are you in your timer?
I could do about 5 more minutes,
okay.
and then hopefully close it out. I'm always happy to kind of come back. Later this year we are doing KubeCon Atlanta. It's our kind of our big anniversary party. And then obviously next year we'll be in Amsterdam for Kubernetes Europe, which is very exciting.
Of course, of course. We want you in the podcast, definitely. But
I would love to go visit and do it live in person.
Yeah, that's awesome. But
Final question.
Yeah. I've got more. I think the biggest problem in what I see from my perspective as an engineer, the biggest problem is now storage. Because and then not the REO storage, but the storage RVX. So the multiple like NFS storage. Because NFS is not our solution, but I see in the market there's nothing except Ceph at the moment.
Yeah, Ceph is it's out there. It runs a ton of workloads, and there are stuff on Kubernetes.
Something else in the future except Ceph for storage for Kubernetes?
It's like things always have a long life cycle, right? Like Ceph is not going anywhere, but I will say based on kind of needs of modern workloads, maybe let's call it GPU based or just modern needs. People are switching between, let's say, maybe classic, NFS, or types things, and NVMe technology now is coming around, right? And Kubernetes is improving, support for different types of storage, platforms. But like I can't speak to look, things like Ceph cluster still very, very much around and won't go away, and Kubernetes supports those decently. It's interesting that you, in your perspective, you feel like storage is a big problem. And storage is important for any type of workload. Where I see the user experience, the challenge of managing Kubernetes or someone getting started is a huge problem. And I'm trying to think of how to end this podcast with a thought of maybe where the future is going. Right now we have, we did a survey recently in CNCF. We have 9.2 million cloud native developers, which is basically mostly Kubernetes developers and users. How do we get to that maybe next 10 million or next, 50 million users? And how do we improve the experience? Because right now, if you go to the Kubernetes website, it's all right, you can go download, Kubernetes. How to get started? Well, there's Minikube, maybe K3S if you want to try to locally. Maybe you download Docker Desktop and it has Kubernetes embedded in it. The current user experience is pretty bad for developers, for folks. So I think one of the future paths for Kubernetes outside of, it will continue to support almost every storage technology, networking technology under the sun as, the platform field. But how do we make it easier to use in general? So if you look at some of the latest things that's happening in Kubernetes land, we had a CNCF project, called, Headlamp, which now has rolled under Kubernetes SIG UI. And if you're familiar with Headlamp is basically a pluggable kind of desktop type interface for Kubernetes, kind of like Docker Desktop in some way. You kind of think it's that similar experience. So you could see a future where when you go to Kubernetes website, maybe the download now offers a kind of Docker Desktop type experience if you ever played with Headlamp, right? And so that is the first. It's kind of like I have friends that were let's call it VMware admins, right? And they're vSphere, love that experience. You could them Kubernetes and oh crap, this is it's dropped down to the command line. It's a little bit, it's I need my vSphere, vMotion experience, right? And I don't think we have that for Kubernetes yet, but I do think the future we will potentially have that with Headlamp, especially if it's the default experience. And I think that will unlock the next 10, 20, 50 million of users when that first experience is a lot easier, downloading plugins, through a nice little desktop experience.
Yeah.
Will unlock. And for some of us, we're not all the youngest developers in the room anymore. But if you remember growing up, it's when I was using the browsers, back in the day, the internet, it's mostly command line experience, Lynx. If you remember Lynx, classic, the lovely browser. Eventually, Mosaic and these kind of desktop browser experience, and the internet went from, maybe a handful of a million folks to hundreds of millions of folks because the way you accessed the internet changed. And my hope is in the future, the way people access Kubernetes by default also changes. So we unlock and have more both developers, admins, and users come. So that's my hope, and I think that's where the future is going with Kubernetes to kind of ensure that it's more accessible to folks.
Okay,
Awesome future.
a good thing to talk about next year in Amsterdam and see where we are.
I will maybe make a wager on this podcast that my hope is you will have hopefully in beta at least that type of experience. And if you haven't checked out Headlamp, I highly recommend playing with it and looking at it because it has I would say check it out. Maybe not fully ready yet for production like most like Sandbox early efforts, but a lot of great things are happening with that project.
Okay, thank you very much.
Very cool.
We'll have a look.
Okay, and see you next year.
Absolutely. I can't wait to be in Amsterdam, and then hopefully your community knows about the upcoming KubeCon. I'm very excited. We just wrapped up. I did a 2-week travel tour in KubeCon Japan and China, which was incredible. KubeCon
Japan jealous.
Out. But yeah, no, super excited to be back in Amsterdam at the RAI Convention Center. So very excited to catch up with you then.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care. All right, have a good one and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
We will.
Bye-bye.
Deze podcast is een initiatief van ACC ICT en wij zijn te beluisteren op onze website k8spodcast.nl via Spotify, Apple en alle andere favoriete podcastproviders.